My name is Heather Vokush, and welcome to another segment of Witnessing History. Now, today we are delighted to be here with the amazing activist Molly Klopot. So thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Now, you just had a 95th birthday. You
Right.
were born in 1919.
Right.
So you have witnessed amazing kinds of history
Yes,
in your life.
yes.
Let's start with your childhood. Now, were you born in Detroit or?
I was born in Buffalo, but my
Okay.
parents moved to Detroit
Okay.
shortly after.
And so during the Depression years, you were in Detroit.
Yes, during the whole. And what I have to tell you,
Mm-hmm.
I have to begin by telling you my roots.
Okay.
Now, in Detroit, my father was a communist.
Mm-hmm.
And in Detroit, there were these organizations, the Poles and the Finns and the Jews. It was a organization where you got medical care, where kids had activities after school. I was in the Jewish part, and I learned to read and write Yiddish, and I wrote to my grandmother in the Soviet Union, and she always wrote back. I never met her personally. Toibe Itze Eisenstadt, her whole name at the bottom of the letter. And each of these communities, we got health care, we could get loans from banks, and all three of these participated in a summer camp, workers' camp, where we would all mix together and we'd all get together at different occasions. Now, this organization gave us, my parents sang in a choir. I not only learned singing, but we had modern dancing, we had drawing. It was a full community that I was immersed in.
Mm-hmm. And actually, I'd like to stop you just for a moment. Were your parents immigrants?
Yes.
Okay.
My father came here, and he was already a communist, and he wanted to get a job in a factory, and he was a skinny little guy.
He came here from Russia?
Russia. My
Okay.
mother came from Russia when she
Okay.
was 6.
Okay.
And he met her when she was working in a glove factory, and he fell in love with her. Well, he wanted to work in a factory, and he was little, and they didn't hire him. So he got a wagon, and I don't know, he went around from town to town making pictures bigger. And
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, this is where I grew up, with that kind of environment. And we had a workers' camp where we would go in the summer, and all groups would get there together, and we'd have our activities there. Once the KKK came and tried to break the camp, but that's where I grew up. And I grew up with the philosophy of dialectical materialism, and you have to know what that means to me.
Can you explain a bit about this?
Now, we need food, clothing, and shelter to live. In order to live as human beings. We don't get that from each other. We get that from the world. And at the beginning, we were hunters and gatherers. And at that time, women were more important than men. They had the children, and they were the hunters and the gatherers of whatever there was. When the guys went out to hunt, you didn't know whether they'd get anything or whether they'd come back. But when we got agriculture, which was by the men, with animals, and you had a surplus, then you had the beginning of class society, where a class got more and oppressed the. All right, so we had feudalism, we had slavery, we had capitalism now, and what we have now is production for profit and not for use. We have the running of the government by the corporations for the corporations. We have a few people having more money than 44% of the rest of the population. So what I'm working for is that we have production for living and not production for use, and from each according to his ability and each according to his need. So you have to know that that's my philosophy.
Yeah, and also this really strong background of community.
Always.
And you have, carried that through your whole life and your
one of my
activism.
cousins fought in Spain.
Okay,
The
in the
others are
Spanish Civil
union
War.
organizers,
Okay.
so we have that in the family.
Yeah, and also the thing about dialectical materialism as well is the whole, the heuristic approach of, approaching change with innovation and not just doing the same kind of thing. And this clearly is something that you have carried through in your activism as well. So thank you for giving us that basis. Now let's continue.
All right, going to my childhood.
Yeah, well, so
I was a pioneer. I remember when I was 8 years old being on a street corner collecting money for the striking miners of West Virginia. So I always felt I was part of this world. I remember as a young pioneer being a chair of the meeting, and we always had books and educational.
And I'm sorry, young pioneer.
Well, that was the young pioneer, then the young communist, and then the communist.
So it was a structured group like that. Okay.
And I said, pioneers for the cause of the working class, are you ready?
And you were 8.
Said, always ready. So that was my background.
Okay. And then the Depression hit, but then also we had things like the UAW strikes. So can you tell us a little bit about, the sit-down strikes?
Well, all right, let me tell you this. I took the exam when Social Security first started. And people said, what, you're paying people to get old? That's silly. But when Social Security started, I took the test, and I passed the test to be in the offices that first started, aid to the blind, aid to dependent children, and old age assistance. And they had to send me back for a few months because apparently I shouldn't have been allowed to take, I wasn't 21. So I started working there when I was 21. And I worked with aid to the blind and aid to dependent children and in the city of Detroit. At the same time, I was active in the Young Communist League. And I remember, for instance, one time when we had been to the Board of Education about something or other, and they chased us away. And I was running down the street, and a cop was chasing me. And I ran into a streetcar. We had streetcars then. And I sat down next to an African-American woman. And the cop came, and he stood in the doorway. And she said to him, she's with me. I'll never forget that. I remember when Sacco and Vanzetti were killed, being with my father, and this great big field of people, and the moan when they were killed.
And I'm sorry, maybe some of the people who are watching don't know who they were. Could you give us just a little tiny bit of background about
These
who they
were
were?
organizers. They were framed and killed.
By the government.
By the government, and there was a world movement to free them. They were anarchists. I'm not an anarchist. But they were anarchists. There was a worldwide movement to free them. They weren't freed. They were killed. And at the moment that they were killed, I don't know how old I was, but I remember being in this great big field with there must have been millions of people, and the moan when they were killed. I remember organizers, women, oh God, I've forgotten her name, speaking with the blood running. She'd been,
she'd been.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I had that experience. I had that feeling of solidarity. I was lucky.
So you were one of the first people who worked in the Social Security, the newly established Social Security Administration. But then you also had, for example, in your teenage years, 2 of your friends were killed in the...
4 of my friends
4 of
were
your
killed in the
friends.
Ford Hunger March. They were
in
going
the Ford
to
Hunger
Ford
March.
for jobs, and they were shot down. And 4 of them were my friends. And I remember, I think I was 13, I remember the funeral. And I remember standing, walking around, and then the great big parade.
But actually, can we go through one more time? So they were going to Ford.
They were part of a demonstration
of
workers. This was during the Depression, when it was selling Apple, And when they were going to the factory to ask for jobs, and they were shot down.
They were shot.
They were killed. 4 of them were killed. The Ford Hunger March, it's known as the Ford Hunger March.
And you were a teenager.
And I was, I think I was 12 at the time.
So, I mean, and then there was this big funeral and everything. How could you possibly make sense out of that?
Oh, it made a lot of sense to me, and it always has. that you have to fight. You have to fight for change. You
Okay.
have to work with everybody to change this world into the world that it can be.
Okay.
And it can be a better world. We can make a living for everybody on this earth.
Mm-hmm.
If it wasn't that there were production for profit, we're ruining the rivers, we're ruining the mountains.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're moving what's happening to the climate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then the Uaw Sit-Down Strikes.
All right.
And-
During the sit-down strikes, we went out to River Rouge, and they didn't even know how to picket. We were teaching them how to picket.
You were teaching people how to picket.
How to picket, and we were
Okay.
singing. That's the Young Communists and the Pioneer. We were singing labor songs, and
Okay.
there was a lot of singing and a lot of and we were singing, and by the end, they were so tired.
And then what happened as a result of that? So you taught
Well, you
them.
got the UAW.
Okay.
That's
yeah.
how we got unions.
Yeah.
You know.
And you've been very active in
Always,
union kinds
yeah.
of activities.
Well, when I became a social worker,
mm-hmm.
my girlfriend and I started the State County Municipal Workers Union.
Mm-hmm.
She was the chair and I was the secretary.
Mm-hmm.
So we've always worked with unions and for unions and with unions, yes.
Which
Yeah.
definitely continues the whole dialectical materialism
Right, right,
part,
right,
I
right.
would say.
And when I was a social worker, I became a social worker,
Mm-hmm.
I taught classes to the kids
Mhm.
in you know, and
You taught classes to the children
to
of
the
union.
children. First, I taught child psychology
Mm-hmm.
to the parents,
Mm-hmm.
you know, as a social worker.
Mhm.
And then we had activities for the kids.
Mm-hmm. So you were always doing things to support union activities.
Union activity and people's involvement.
Okay. Let's go now a little bit to the whole World War II issue. How did you hear? Do you remember hearing that World War II had officially
Yes,
broken
I
out?
remember we were listening to the radio,
Mm-hmm.
and we knew then. My girlfriend and I quit our jobs as social workers,
Mm-hmm.
and we both took courses so we could work in the factory.
Mm-hmm.
Detroit was the arsenal of democracy.
The Arsenal of Democracy.
That's what it was called, the arsenal of democracy, yeah. And so she went to work at Ford
Mhm.
River Rouge, I think. I went to work at Ford Highland Park.
Mm-hmm.
And when I went to the first union meeting,
Mm-hmm.
there were guys fighting with each other. I don't know what they were, and they had big sticks. And when one guy would talk and the other guy didn't like it, they would bang the stick on the floor and make a noise. And then somebody said, well, let's ask that little lady what she thinks. I don't remember what it was. When I stood up to talk on whatever it was, the part that supported the guy didn't want to hear what I said. The other guy, anyway, I did speak, and I organized the first women's committee that we had at the Ford Motor Company. Now, we had all these women in the factory then. They took the courses, and they went to work in the factory. Detroit was the arsenal of democracy. Ford he didn't do anything. We were sitting there writing letters. They didn't start any production until the government started paying him on a cost. What he did, they got paid for. And then it was like a movie that you make go real fast. Then we began to have production in the factory.
And what kind of courses did you take? You mentioned
Oh,
courses.
and I was in assembly and the work that
So you
but
were
I was-
Rosie the Riveter. You were.
I was Rosie the Riveter, yeah. And I was elected committee woman. Now, a lot of the women were anti-union, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And being in that position, I was able to involve women.
Mm-hmm.
We had, among the things that we had was, you know, at that time there was, you couldn't just go and buy whatever you wanted to because we had to have, what do you call it?
Vouchers or something like
Yeah,
that.
so we were making sure that people didn't.
That they only got the
Yeah,
vouchers
yeah,
that they should
yeah.
have, and they
Yeah,
didn't
that-
steal
and
or
yeah.
something like that.
And another thing that we did was that I organized for all the shifts, because we had 3 shifts going. We had a sing out and we had Pete Seeger. Pete Seeger was there, and they were singing "Ist das nicht der Fascist" along with Pete Seeger, when a lot of them are followers of the fascist priest.
So which fascist priest? Can you tell us who this is?
Father Coughlin.
Okay, can you give us a little bit of background about this guy? Who was he and what did he do?
He was just someone who was anti-democratic.
Okay, and he came through on the radio?
And he was on the radio, yeah.
Okay.
So what we had, I organized the women, and then we organized, we got Ford to give us place and to provide buses so the servicemen in the area where we were could be brought to our party. You know, we organized, like a USO, we organized activities that for them also. So we organized the women to see that the grocery stores didn't, and we organized so that they could be with provide with the servicemen. And the first thing I did, the women didn't want to wear anything, their hair got caught in the machines.
Okay.
So I organized a fashion contest.
A fashion contest.
I have some pictures in the paper there. And we got the hat companies in the city to donate how the women could cover their hair and still look pretty.
Okay.
And we had it for all the shifts.
Oh my goodness.
We had a fashion show, and it was written up in the paper.
Well, I mean, it's the most amazing, activism at that time. It's fantastic. My question is, though, with your political background, what were you thinking about the politics during World War II?
Was to support the war.
Okay.
Support the war.
Because
it was a just war against fascism.
And then when the war ended, do you remember?
No, before the war ended. See, what happened is that my girlfriend and I decided to visit our brothers before they went overseas.
Okay.
So we drove to my brother in Denver, and then we drove to her brother in Texas. And then I decided to see my cousins in Los Angeles, and I went on to Los Angeles, and I stayed in LA. Instead of coming back, I stayed in LA and got a job as a medical social worker.
Oh.
And I read the communist papers, and in the communist papers there was a guy who had a column, Soldier's Notebook, and I sent him some of my brother's letters, which were very funny, and he printed them. And then we wrote a lot, and then I had to go meet him.
You had to go meet the guy who did this?
Meet that guy who was a soldier in Texas in a amputee center in Brownswood, Texas.
And I'm sorry, is the war still going on at this time?
The war's going on,
okay.
Yeah. So I go to see him, and he wants me to stay, and he's going to be sent overseas, and so I stayed. And I worked in a factory that made wooden boxes for guns, and great big wooden boxes, heavy, and we had to pick up and put it in a machine. And it was very, very hot, 100 degrees. We worked 10 hours a day.
My goodness.
Yeah. And here were the people who were working with me were the wives and the girlfriends of the soldiers they had come to see, who were stationed in this amputee center. And they were talking about the international Jewish bankers. So I asked them, who owns the department store? Who owns the bank? And when the war ended, the day we had gotten a prize from the government for our work.
This factory that did the boxes.
In this little factory, yeah, we got this prize. The women got 40 cents, I told you. The men got 45 cents an hour. The day that the war ended, we were all fired. Yeah, and that's when I went to San Francisco, and from there I got the scholarship and went to
to Colombia
to be a social worker.
And then you started organizing people in Colombia, which was great, and you set up these amazing courses, you know, and educational programs. And then my understanding is that around 1953 or something, you were in Europe and also Russia. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I went to an international conference on children because I always worked with children.
In Europe?
In your home city. Yeah.
So you were in Vienna, Austria?
In Vienna, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
around
and
1953.
I remember looking at the opera house, and I remember I had to get different shoes because of those cobbled streets. And I remember the wonderful food.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
So you went to an international conference then, and then somehow you ended up in Russia?
Well, because there were 6 of us from the Americas. There were 4 women from the United States and a married couple from Canada. And we were invited by the Soviet Women's Anti-Fascist Committee to be their guests for 2 weeks. And they took us, we were in a hotel in Moscow. We were there May 1st, the demonstration, you know, that they have May 1st, sitting in the same place where Stalin was. And they took us through factories.
What was that like?
We could see what the war had done to that country. We could also see the special things they did for children. They had children's houses. We all could see the number of kids who were left as orphans. And we went to a collective farm. They took us to a collective farm. They took us to different factories to see how they worked. And from there, I went to, there was an International Women's Congress where I ended up. And I worked with the Women's International Democratic Federation. And I met all these women who'd been partisans. I remember the Chinese secretary when we had meetings, and the Chinese secretary, she was in the Long March, and she later became a member of the government in China.
Okay.
And she would begin by saying, what you have to do, she would always begin saying, I agree with you and you and you. And then she'd say what she could. But she said, education, demonstration, and persuasion. And that has been my motto. That's what I believe in. Education, demonstration, and persuasion.
For me, it's such an interesting path, you know, coming from this small but very tight community in New York, and then you rather quickly ended up on the international stage in Moscow with all of these women from across the world who were joined by a community of spirit.
Yeah,
I guess you could say.
Yeah.
And you have continued that now. Can you tell us about some of your work with the various granny groups?
Oh, so when I came, my husband died, and I went to Cuba at the end of that year, and I wanted to tell people about that. And I went to the WILF, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which is the oldest women's peace organization in this country.
And I'm so sorry, I'm gonna interrupt you just a second. You went to Cuba, and this was at the end of 53 or 54?
90, I think.
Okay. Can you give us just one sentence? Why were you in Cuba? What did you do there?
Oh, it was a group that went to look at Cuba.
Okay.
There was an International Women's Conference in Cuba.
Okay. Oh,
Yeah,
wonderful,
yeah,
wonderful.
yeah.
And so then, I'm sorry, you were talking about WILF.
So I went there, and they wanted me to speak in different places. And WILF had the largest number of women there. So I went to their office to see if they had some of the speeches in English. And when I came in, there was this tall, stately woman and all these cards on the floor. It was really disorganized. And I began to work with them, and she died. And I just
took over.
Yeah, with someone who did, you know, because I couldn't do the typing and all that.
So you've gone from that. You also deal with the grannies for.
All right. So then, while I was I heard about the raging grannies of Canada. You know what they do? They take popular songs and they change the words and they sing them at demonstrations and meetings and so on. So I wrote to them, and then we started our own.
In New York.
Here, our own branch. Then they have these grannies all over, and there was a Tucson group. Now the Tucson group had gone into the recruiting station and said they wanted to be recruited instead of their kids because we were at war. And they were brought out to a...
This was during the Iraq War?
Yeah.
Okay.
And they were brought to a piece of land that was private property, and they were arrested for being on private property. And they were on TV. So I put out a call for women who would be interested in doing the same thing. And we had a meeting, and I got it was on TV. I got that, they sent me that, and we called the women, and we decided to do the same thing. And then we put out a call, 18 women, well, there were more, there were people who supported us, but we were arrested, you know.
So you went down to a recruiting center, and you also said we went right here in New York.
Here in New York, and we were arrested for disturbing the peace or whatever, and we had a 7-day trial, or a 6-day trial, and we were found not guilty.
And you have been just going ever since, which is so inspiring.
But that's the thing. That's at work, for instance. I'm a social worker. When I went to work, I was on the OBS-GYN service, and I found all these teenage kids who were not going to school. I organized a group around the pregnant teens, the Coney Island Council on Services to Pregnant Teens. And we got them. I remember when we went with a group of the kids to the Board of Education, and how they reacted when they saw that I came in with the kids. But by the end, they were shaking the kids' hands because they were so glad to hear from them.
I have one final question. If you have one message that you'd like to share with people all across the world, what would that be?
All right. The message is that you must be with people of all ages.
Okay.
That you must be involved with something bigger than yourself. And that you must keep going.
Okay. Well, I can't thank you enough for having joined us today, Molly Klopot.
Oh,
thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
And on that inspiring note, we thank you also for having joined us.